I was only 8 years old when I first began noticing something strange about the old house my grandparents lived in. It was a tall, wooden home with creaky floors and narrow hallways that always seemed darker than they should have been, even during the day. Every summer, my parents would take me there, and while the adults chatted endlessly in the kitchen, I would wander around the house, exploring. But there was one part of the house that I never liked passing by: the upstairs guest room. The door was always closed, and unlike the other doors in the house, it had a habit of rattling late at night, as though someone was trying to open it from the inside. When I asked my grandmother about it, she would simply smile too quickly and say, "It's just the wind, dear." But what unsettled me was how she avoided eye contact whenever I asked. Even at that age, I could sense that her answer wasn't the truth. One night, when I woke up for a glass of water, I heard a soft humming sound coming from behind that door. It wasn't the sound of the wind. It was slow, tuneless, and childlike, as if someone was humming a lullaby, but just a little out of rhythm, as though whoever was doing it had forgotten how the melody was supposed to go. My small feet froze on the hallway carpet, my hands still clutching the banister. The longer I listened, the colder the air around me felt, and the more I realized that I wasn't supposed to be hearing that sound at all. I stood frozen in the hallway that night, every instinct telling me to run back to my bed, but my curiosity, childlike and stubborn, kept me rooted in place. The humming from behind the guest room door grew clearer, rising and falling in uneven tones, like someone trying to remember a song from long ago. The longer I listened, the more I noticed that the humming wasn't coming from deep within the room, but from just behind the door itself, as if the source was standing only inches away from me on the other side. I pressed my hand against the wooden frame, half expecting it to be warm from the presence of whoever or whatever was there, but it was icy cold, so cold that it made my fingertips tingle. That should have been enough to send me running, but something about the sound fascinated me. It was soft, strangely inviting, like it wanted me to listen longer. That I leaned closer, my ear almost against the door, when the humming suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was so heavy that I could hear my own pulse pounding in my head. Then, with no warning, the doorknob turned slowly, so slowly that I could hear the faint metallic click of its inner mechanism shifting. I gasped and stumbled back, watching in disbelief as the knob quivered but did not fully open. My small shadow stretched across the hall in the dim, night-like glow, and I remember feeling as though the very air was waiting to see what I would do next. For a long moment, I stood in shock, staring, afraid that the door would swing open at any second. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the rattling stopped. The doorknob stilled, and silence filled the house once again. As though nothing had happened, I hurried back to my room, my little heart racing faster than ever before. I hid under the blanket, whispering to myself that it was only the wind, only the old creaky house playing tricks on me. But deep inside, I knew it wasn't the wind. I knew someone or something had been on the other side of that door, humming a lullaby that was never meant for me to hear. The next morning, sunlight poured through the curtains, but it did little to ease the memory of what I had heard the night before. As I sat at the breakfast table, I kept glancing at the staircase that led to the upper floor, half expecting to see the guest room door cracked open. My grandmother moved around the kitchen with her usual smile, humming to herself as she flipped pancakes on the stove. For a moment, I froze because the tune she was humming sounded strangely familiar. It wasn't identical, but something about the uneven rhythm reminded me of the lullaby from behind that door. I stared at her, my fork suspended halfway to my mouth, and when she noticed me watching, she stopped humming instantly and asked if I wanted more syrup. The question was casual, but her eyes darted to the stairs for the briefest second, and I knew she had caught me making the connection. Later that morning, I gathered enough courage to bring it up. "Grandma," I asked carefully, "who stays in the guest room?" She looked startled, as though I had broken some unspoken rule. My grandfather, sitting across the table with his newspaper, cleared his throat and answered before she could speak. "Nobody," he said firmly, folding the paper as if to end the conversation. "That room's been empty for years." His tone carried no warmth, no room for more questions. but I couldn't stop myself. Then, why did I hear someone in there last night? The silence that followed was louder than any noise. My grandmother's hands trembled just slightly as she set a teacup down on the table, and my grandfather gave me a sharp look I had never seen from him before. "It was the wind," he said again, this time more sternly. "You let your imagination run wild." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But as the day went on, I noticed something odd. Whenever I walked too close to the stairs, my grandmother's eyes followed me carefully. And if I lingered even for a moment, she would find an excuse to call me back into the living room or the garden. It was as though the very act of being near that guest room was forbidden. That made me want to see it even more. I didn't dare try the door in daylight, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever secret my grandparents were hiding, the answers were locked inside that room. That afternoon, when the adults were distracted in the garden, I decided it was my chance to investigate. The sun was high, the house filled with golden light, and I told myself that nothing frightening could happen in broad daylight. My small feet creaked softly on the old wooden stairs as I climbed, every step sounding louder than it should in the hushed house. When I reached the hallway, I stopped in front of the guest room door. It looked so ordinary, plain wood with a brass knob slightly tarnished from age, yet it carried an air that felt entirely out of place with the rest of the cheerful home. For a long moment, I stood there, my heart beating against my chest, half expecting to hear that strange humming again. But all I could hear was the faint tick of the grandfather clock downstairs that I stretched out my hand and wrapped my fingers around the doorknob. It was cold, colder than any other metal in the house, as though it had been sitting in shade for years. I twisted gently, but the door didn't budge. Locked. The faintest disappointment, mixed with relief, washed over me. I leaned closer, pressing my ear to the wood, and at first, there was only silence. Then, so faint I thought I imagined it, I heard a sound. Not humming this time, but the rustle of movement like fabric brushing against fabric, or someone slowly shifting in a chair. I jumped back, staring at the door in disbelief. The air in the hallway suddenly felt heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath before I could decide what to do. A floorboard creaked behind me. My grandmother's voice floated up the stairs, cheerful but too sharp. "What are you doing up there, dear?" I nearly tripped over my own feet as I scrambled away from the door. "Nothing," I shouted, my voice cracking. She appeared at the top of the stairs a moment later, holding a basket of folded laundry. Her eyes landed on me, then on the door, and though her smile never faltered, her grip on the basket tightened. "That room is off limits," she said softly, but there was no warmth in her tone now, only a quiet warning. I nodded quickly and hurried back downstairs, but I couldn't shake what I had heard. If the room was empty, why did it sound like someone was moving around inside? And why did my grandmother's voice carry that subtle edge, as though she wasn't just protecting me from the room, but protecting the room from me? That night, I lay in bed longer than usual, listening to the house as it settled into silence. The ticking of the old grandfather clock drifted faintly up the stairs, but everything else was hushed. I tried to close my eyes and sleep, but my thoughts kept circling back to the guest room. I couldn't forget the cold doorknob, the faint rustle behind the wood, or the strange way my grandmother's voice sharpened when she caught me near it. At some point, as the moonlight spilled across the ceiling of my room, I realized I was holding my breath, listening for something I couldn't name. That was when I heard it again, a T first. It was just a soft hum, almost too faint to notice. The same uneven melody, drifting down the hallway as if carried by the night itself. My chest tightened instantly. This time, however, it wasn't coming only from the door upstairs. It was moving. The sound floated softly from the direction of the guest room, then paused, then seemed to travel along the hallway floorboards, as though someone invisible was slowly pacing just outside the room. The humming would fade for a moment, then return closer, clearer, like a breath brushing against the edges of my ears. I sat up in bed, frozen, every nerve in my body screaming to hide beneath the blanket, yet I couldn't look away from my open bedroom door. For several long minutes, the sound lingered, circling, and then it stopped. Silence fell again, thick and heavy, But before I could even sigh in relief, I heard something new, a soft tap. Then another. It was rhythmic, almost like fingertips lightly tapping the wooden floor, moving closer and closer until they seemed to stop right outside my room. I held perfectly still, clutching the blanket to my chest, my eyes glued to the doorway. The hall light was faint, but I could swear a shadow darker than the rest shifted just beyond the frame. I wanted to call for my grandparents, but my voice refused to come. My throat was tight, as if the air itself had sealed it shut. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the faint humming returned, this time right outside my door. It was softer than ever, almost like a whisper in song, as if whoever was out there was leaning close, waiting for me to answer. I squeezed my eyes shut and stayed that way until exhaustion eventually pulled me into uneasy sleep. Yet even in my dreams, I could still hear that broken lullaby looping endlessly, refusing to let me go. When morning finally came, it felt unreal, like the sunlight itself didn't belong inside the house anymore. I woke with my heart still pounding, the memory of that broken lullaby clinging to me as if it had followed me from my dreams. At breakfast, I sat quietly, too afraid to say what I had heard. My grandmother served eggs and toast as though everything were normal, her movements perfectly practiced, but every time the floor creaked upstairs, her hands flinched ever so slightly. My grandfather sat stiffly with his newspaper, but I noticed that he hadn't turned a page for nearly 10 minutes. Both of them looked tired, their smiles stretched thinner than usual, as though they had also heard the noises but were determined to pretend otherwise. I tried to act casual, though my curiosity was bubbling up inside me. "Did either of you hear music last night?" I asked, keeping my tone as light as possible. The reaction was immediate. My grandmother's fork clattered softly against her plate, and my grandfather lowered the paper just enough for me to see his eyes. "Music," he repeated, his voice too controlled. "No, of course not. This house creaks. You know that." But something about the way his jaw tightened told me he was lying. My grandmother quickly added, "You were probably dreaming, dear. Sometimes dreams feel so real at your age." Her voice trembled, though she forced a smile. I nodded, but I knew they were hiding something as the day wore on. I noticed little things I hadn't before. The guest room door now had an extra lock at the top of the frame, a small brass latch that I was certain hadn't been there yesterday. Every time I walked down the hall, I felt my grandmother's watchful gaze following me, as though she was making sure I didn't get too close again. Once, when I brushed my hand against the wall near the guest room, she called out sharply from downstairs, her tone almost panicked, "Don't linger there." It was so out of character that it startled me. That night, before bed, I overheard my grandparents whispering in the kitchen. Their voices were hushed, but the house carried sound too well. I pressed myself against my bedroom door and listened. "The child hears it," my grandfather muttered, his voice low and stern. My grandmother replied, almost in a whisper, "I told you we should have sealed that room long ago." There was a pause, followed by the scrape of a chair. Then my grandfather's voice, harder this time, "Don't speak of it. If we ignore it, it will quiet down again." My heart pounded as I tiptoed back into bed, their words echoing in my mind. Ignore what? Seal what? I had no answers, but one thing was certain. Whatever lived inside that guest room, my grandparents knew far more than they were willing to tell. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, every creak of the house amplified, every whisper of wind outside twisting into something more sinister in my imagination. My grandparents had gone to bed hours earlier, but I could still feel the weight of their silence pressing against the walls. Their whispered conversation from earlier circled endlessly in my head. "Seal the room. Ignore it. The child hears it." Those words left me with the uneasy certainty that I was not imagining things. Whatever I had heard outside my room, whatever had been humming, was real. The house grew quieter and quieter until I could hear nothing but the sound of my own breath. And then, as though the silence had been waiting for the right moment, it began again. That broken lullaby. Slow, uneven, drifting through the air like a forgotten memory. This time it wasn't faint. It was clear, as though the voice had moved closer during the day, now bold enough to be heard with no effort. My blood turned cold. The sound came not only from the guest room. It was in the hallway again, that same uneven pacing of footsteps, followed by the rise and fall of the melody. I sat upright in bed, clutching my blanket tightly, my eyes fixed on the crack of my bedroom door. The humming grew louder, softer, then louder again, as though the presence was moving back and forth, undecided about something. Then the footsteps stopped directly outside my door. I dare not breathe. For several heartbeats, there was only silence, heavy and suffocating. Then came the sound that froze every muscle in my body, the slow turn of my doorknob that a key twisted gently, then paused. The metal squeaked softly, as though someone, or something, was testing how much strength it would take to open it. My chest tightened, my throat dry, but I couldn't look away. The knob jiggled again, more insistent this time, rattling quietly in the frame. My whole body screamed to run, to call for my grandparents, but fear rooted me in place. I sat in the glow of the moonlight, staring as the knob twisted one last time, then stilled. And then came the sound that was worse than the humming, worse than the footsteps, worse than the knob itself. A whisper. It wasn't clear, just a faint breath of sound slipping through the doorframe, like someone leaning close and trying to speak to me through the wood. The words were distorted, stretched, almost like a child mumbling in their sleep. I couldn't understand it, but the intent was unmistakable. It was calling to me. For minutes that felt like hours, the whispering continued, a hushed murmur rising and falling in patterns I didn't recognize. Finally, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. The knob released, the air lightened, and the house returned to stillness. I sat there trembling, too afraid to move, my ears ringing with the echo of that broken voice that I didn't sleep at all that night. I simply waited, counting the minutes until morning, wondering how long it would be before that door, or mine, finally opened. When morning finally arrived, I felt more exhausted than if I hadn't slept at all. My body ached from lying stiff in bed all night, my ears still ringing with the memory of that whisper at my door. For a moment, I convinced myself it had all been a nightmare, until I stepped out into the hallway. That was when I saw it. Right outside my bedroom, pressed against the floorboards near the doorframe, was a faint mark. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but when I crouched down, I realized it was something else entirely. The wood looked worn, as if small hands had been pressing there repeatedly over time. The varnish dulled in a shape too precise to be an accident. It was the faint impression of fingers. 5 small outlines, smudged and uneven, as though someone had knelt there night after night, touching the floor while leaning close to listen to my stomach turned cold. I stared at the marks, tracing them with my eyes, knowing full well they hadn't been there before. The hallway was always spotless. My grandmother polished the wood floors religiously. This was new, fresh, proof that what I had heard wasn't just a dream. I glanced toward the guest room at the far end of the hall. Its door was shut tight, the new brass latch glinting faintly in the daylight, but the very sight of it sent a chill through me. The humming, the whispers, the doorknob. Everything pointed back to that room, a tea breakfast. I tried to act normal, though the weight of what I'd seen gnawed at me. My grandmother asked me to pass the butter, and as I slid the dish across the table, I blurted it out before I could stop myself. There are fingerprints on the floor outside my room. The words made both my grandparents freeze. My grandfather's fork hovered above his plate, his hand rigid. My grandmother forced a laugh, too quickly. Just smudges, dear. Old houses show all kinds of marks. But she didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at my grandfather, as if waiting for him to step in. He set his fork down slowly and fixed me with a stare that felt heavier than any scolding. "Don't go looking for things that aren't there," he said firmly, his voice low and unyielding. The way he spoke made me shrink in my chair. For the rest of the meal, no one said another word. But later that day, when my grandparents stepped outside to tend the garden, I couldn't resist going back to the hallway. I knelt down in the exact spot where I had seen the prints, and though the sunlight shifted differently now, I could still make out the faint grooves on the wood. They weren't just smudges. They were shallow impressions, like pressure had been applied again and again over the years, worn into the very surface of the floor. And that was when I noticed something else. Along the edge of the guest room door, faint as dust, was a line of scratches. They weren't deep, but they ran vertically, jagged and uneven, as if nails, small ones, like those of a child, had dragged downward across the wood, again and again. My breath caught in my throat as I backed away, the realization sinking in. Whatever was in that room hadn't always been content to stay behind the door. It had tried to get out.